So it's a real pleasure tonight to introduce Michael Wilkes. And the reason why I bring executives in the cybersecurity space to these events is because people can't barge your office and ask you what you do, right, for a living.
No, hopefully you can't find my office.
Right, exactly.
It's in the cloud.
And it's in the cloud, and it's a bit of an enigma, I like it. But we do hear, be on the news, where chief information security officers come out and, getting some heat for events that happen with the enterprise and so on. So the purpose of this conversation today is really to open up the kimono a little bit, right, and explain, who you are, what's your background, where you come from, what's your views on the world of cybersecurity specifically. So when we get started, I always start with the kind of the question, superhero question, but
sure.
But for you, there's a special meaning for that. So
sure, I have a favorite superhero, and it's Iron Man. And the reason I like Iron Man the best is because he's not a god or a mutant, right? He's just a regular guy. He's got some issues, right? He has some trust and darkness, that haunts him throughout the series of movies. But for me, I also have a stronger affiliation because I used to be the head of security for Marvel. And so for 2 years, it was my job to keep Iron Man safe.
Wow.
And if any of you have seen Endgame, you know what happened after I left.
So, we know each other for quite some time, and I know a bit of your background, and it's really fascinating. Why don't you walk us through kind of like how you got into the security space, and just maybe from the beginning? That would be pretty great.
Well, I could use the whole time to tell that story, because I like telling it, but the Reader's Digest version is that I graduated from Stanford with a philosophy degree, and so now I'm head of security. But no, the in-between is that I actually started auditing websites as one of my first jobs after leaving the think tank, which was actually a useless idea. I went to work for the Department of Education, and I was responsible for California, Arizona, Nevada, and Utah, K-12 public education, model technology schools, educational technology grants, distance learning, things like that. This is about the time when Al Gore was inventing the internet. Right? And so what I realized working in San Francisco is there's nothing I could do to make education better at the federal or state level. There were more computers in the dumpsters of California than in classrooms. And so that's when my hobby became my career. So my days on the internet go back to the very first telnet, and even Gopher protocol, if anyone remembers port 70, before port 80 came along and eclipsed all that traffic with the World Wide Web and NCSA Mosaic. But so I've been around a long time. I've been hacking and doing all the things that kids did, back in the day when war games came out. That was sort of my intro to technology. So self-taught, never studied computers, but eventually I started lying in interviews and saying, yeah, I know how to write Perl. And so I worked at a company that was analyzing log files, and I was given the job of analyzing Yahoo's logs as a third party, auditing it in like 1994. So my whole career path is luck. Everything has been not through intelligence or design or goal setting. It was just getting lucky. And so I analyzed Yahoo. They're getting 20 million hits a day when I was analyzing it. And that's like most people's extranets now, right? But when it grew to 300 million hits a day, I realized there's nothing I could do to stop that. I felt like the kid with his finger in the dike trying to hold back the ocean. So that's when I moved to the content side and started developing websites for a company called Organic. And there, it was the rise of the .coms, right? I have the privilege of running the team that gave Starbucks its first website in 1998, and Macy's.com, PlayStation.com. You may have heard of a site called Blockbuster.com. We built that site as well. That one didn't last as long as it might have if they knew how to predict the future. But, so anyway, it's been a lot of luck. And being open to trying new things, and those first few lies on those first few interviews, because it is true, you really can, fake it until you make it.
It's fantastic. And so, what it is that you do today as a chief information security officer? What's your kind of day-to-day look like?
Yeah, since January, I've been the head of security for ASCAP, and people kind of make fun of that name if they don't know what it means, but it's the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers. So it's a 105-year-old company. It was founded here in New York by like Irving Berlin and Victor Herbert, and they wanted to make sure the people that wrote music got paid for writing it. And so think about technology, right, and robots and machine learning. Well, back then the challenge was player pianos, right, because you didn't need someone to play the piano in a restaurant, right? They had these rolls with these holes punched in them. And so they wanted to make sure that the writers were going to get paid for the creative music that they were contributing. And so the mission of ASCAP is incredible. I love it. It's 1.2 billion in revenue in 2018, and we gave 1.1 billion of that revenue back to the members. So it's a member-based organization. It's a not-for-profit. So I'm really aligned with the mission. I'm an ASCAP member. I'm a musician myself. And so, these are the people whose art and craftsmanship kind of stitches together the fabric of society. So I love ASCAP. I can talk about it all night, but certainly it's an important mission to protect the PII of Beyonce, Justin Timberlake, people like that, as well as your average mom and pop and people you've never heard of that maybe wrote a song that Ariana Grande sings, right? We pay the person that wrote that song, and so it's a very values-driven organization.
It's funny. The first musician, right, that went into cybersecurity. This seems to be almost like a common thread. And then also, it's totally evident that you're also passionate about technology. You're curious. That's kind of how successful people in the space come to be. So, in your past experiences, you obviously you built the Blockbuster website. What have you seen change in the past several years? And then, if you could predict the future and had a crystal ball to see where this industry is going.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a shortage of talent, right? And so I kind of want to encourage anyone to get into cybersecurity, even if you didn't go to Stanford, and even if you didn't study computer science or philosophy. Just because we need everyone's perspective, right? To democratize the tools and the field, we need people of color. We need women in cybersecurity. It can't be just a bunch of white males like me, right? It has to be a more diverse, perspective to make our defenses stronger against, the attacks and against the attack vectors and the bad actors. What have I seen change? I was looking back and thinking actually about the launch of Starbucks. Microsoft donated hardware so they could say Starbucks was running on Windows. Of course, Windows was a crappy web server back in 1998, and IIS. And so we actually were worried about the site crashing on launch. So I actually did something then which could now be called deception, which was I put an Apache web server in front of Starbucks, and then I just recompiled the host headers to say that it was IIS. And so all the script kiddies would be coming at us with stuff, but it was an Apache proxying Starbucks. Don't tell Starbucks I did this, and it was great because Microsoft got their press release. The site didn't go down. I had my night's rest, hosting and launching the site. And so now I think deception is really a new area of proactive defensive technology, where you throw up 50 decoys into AWS, and if you have 100 machines, that's 50% potentially that's going to be attacked by something that doesn't matter. So Minerva, I think, Systems is working on something like that. There's managed services that'll build decoy infrastructure. Software-defined networking gives this whole quicksand that the bad guys can be playing around in while you're still running your business and keeping the revenue working. So I think that's one of the trends that I think is interesting to try to predict the future is how can we be like those butterflies that look like snakes, and the birds don't eat them. It's like an evolutionary kind of thing.
So you kind of mentioned that you encourage people to get into cybersecurity. What would you recommend the path they take? As you mentioned, everyone has a very diverse path and there's no one correct answer. But if you can share some of the attributes of these successful folks, and then also from past conversation, you have kind of a unique approach to looking at candidates that come over and interview with you, right?
I do. I have a pretty tough phone screen. I do a 20-minute phone screen, and about 3% make it through to on-site. But I just ask a basic set of questions, and I'll ask a DevOps person or an infosec person the same question. My first question is, what's the difference between TCP and UDP? If you don't know the fundamentals of how computers and the internet work, you could be a valuable contributor to compliance and documentation and other things, but you can't actually do things like that get down to the basics of what it is we're talking about, right? It's like understanding that water is wet and the sky is blue, right? You need to know the fundamentals, in my mind, to be a good technologist, right? And so, being able to know the difference between that is kind of like a pass-fail question, or basic DNS, and so I ask those few questions. So if I do 30 phone screens, one person comes on site. That person though has passed the basics. And then I start asking them security questions. What do you know about Spectre Meltdown? How would you explain that to the CEO? So how do you translate something that's fairly technical, right? The architectural vulnerabilities in Spectre and Meltdown. You need to be good with analogies and metaphors. And that's where I think my background in philosophy helps a lot. Because I can translate, and be in the weeds with all the technologists, but still go to the C-level suite and to the board and say, look, it's kind of like a fast food restaurant. People wanted to make the food, the burgers, which is the compute, faster. So they created speculative execution. I don't say that word in front of the board, but they wanted to make sure that when you order that hamburger, it comes out really fast. So sometimes they make hamburgers before you order it, and that's what speculative execution is. And if it came off of the heat lamps, that's cache, right? And if they made it from scratch because you wanted no pickles but with cheese, then it took a minute to make the hamburger instead of 30 seconds. And that's really the basic vulnerability behind Spectre Meltdown, is you can abuse that information to know what the person after you or before you in the drive-through window ordered, because you know whether it came off of the cache. And anyway, that was one of those analogies that I thought was helpful, and I try to share this skill, because that's, I think, what locks a lot of technical people out of a management path, is the ability to dumb it down and say, no, it's really a lot like the sky isn't blue, right? If you really want to explain, like, everyone freaked out about Spectre and Meltdown because it meant water is not wet, right? Kernel space and user space was totally violated by those vulnerabilities in the kernel, or in the silicon. And so anyway, those are some of the advice I would give is, learn the basics, right? The fundamentals. It's just like, a soldier disassembling his rifle or whatever, right? You need to do that in your sleep. You need to be able to do packet captures and understand what's going on, what's the attack surface, what's the threat model for the application.
It's funny, it's always boils down to burgers, like the burger index, for example. So that's great. So you have really kind of a different approach to, and by the way, you burned that question. You're going to have to come up with different ones now. How do you, there's about 3,000 vendors out there, for example, that participated in RSA this past year. Do you have a unique approach to looking at new technologies as well?
Yeah, I think so. They have to have a passion for what they're doing. So at RSA this year, I went to the seed round, early startups, and there's maybe 20 or 30 vendors in there, but I only talked to like 2 of them. And one of them was really interesting. And how do you identify something that you think has legs? How do you identify some new technology that you think this could actually change the game? And so in this case, I'll give them a small plug. It was zero knowledge proof. So anyone that's familiar with zero knowledge databases and zero knowledge proof means, what is the problem with authentication? Passwords, a shared secret. You know the password, and we have a hash of it in our database. If you can get beyond that and have a zero knowledge proof, then you can actually have true passwordless auth. So these guys actually started up a program, an offering, where you don't store passwords anymore. And I would love to get beyond this whole era of passwords, right? And not just, no one's typing it all the time, but it's still there, where there actually is no password. So you can't be in a headline of a news story for a data breach because you don't actually have a copy of the passwords. So really radical new approaches. One of the ways to identify them, and this was something that came back years ago, I used to live in Amsterdam and work on infrastructure for KLM and Rabobank and ING and things like that. And I took a trip to California because they had this Netherlands, California, Silicon Valley alliance. And one of the themes that came out, and this is many years ago, probably 2005 or so, but one of the themes that came out of it is, if you're not trusting people under 30, you're not going to be a part of any major technological evolution or innovation or disruption that's happening. And that was a big deal, because in Europe and in Holland, you had to be a gray-haired old guy, to be trusted. But think of all the innovation that came out of Silicon Valley, like the semiconductor and TCP and just Apple computer, personal computers. All of that was for people under 30. And so if you're not looking at the youth to find these disruptive ideas, then you're not looking in the right place necessarily.
What's also fascinating is that it seems like we keep getting more information in the news about the new technologies come down the pipe, like 5G and its vulnerabilities. We're talking sometimes about, and it's actually coming up now because of the election, like election security, deep fakes. There's a lot of areas that are, it seems like almost advancing, where we kind of fall behind a little in terms of cybersecurity and the advancement of tools to protect us from all the new innovations. So where do you see that's going? For example, what's your thought about election security and like deep fakes, for example?
I looked at the prior Fireside chat, and so I prepped myself mentally for this one. So how am I going to answer the question about election security without, getting political? I think quantum computing is the answer. So the Swiss were working on a quantum voting system, right? So if somebody observed your vote, it changed the spin of the product, right? It was observable that someone had observed it. So if we want to use quantum computing, we don't want IBM Watson going up against Google saying, oh, we solved elliptical curve and we've cracked it, No, we should just be using it to make good voting technology. So quantum computing should be used for voting, because then you could have absolute privacy, because the act of observing the particle or the spin or the position changes it. And so that would be something that we ought to put research into. I don't think enough research is going into it. I know the Swiss were working on it many years ago. I was at a Hacking at Random, which is one of those camping things that happens in Europe, and all the hackers go out in the middle in the rain in tents, and they build Wi-Fi networks, and they talk about quantum crypto and quantum storage. The big problem with quantum storage is it doesn't last very long, right? Most people expect to be able to answer, ask the database a question and get the same answer tomorrow, but the half-life on quantum storage is, nanoseconds or less, right? So, but until they solve that, these are the kind of systems I'd like to see us invest time and energy in for innovation. And then for the 5G question, I had to do a little research on it, but basically it's just supply chain risk, right? People are worried about a certain vendor that begins with the letter H, that makes a lot of network equipment, and would they have backdoors in it, but that's always been the case, right? There's been backdoors in stuff, since the beginning of time. Intel was having, plain text, backdoors for lawful interception purposes on chips and network interfaces. So it's not nothing new. It just maybe is a little bit political now because of the current climate. But the 5G risk, I think it's the same old supply chain risk that we've always had.
Right. And then also a lot of vendors, they taught like AI, artificial intelligence, and machine learning, and there's a lot of automation, right? It's the idea is that we can kind of reduce the attack surface or the vulnerabilities by having machines do the first scanning or do the first vulnerability testing. What are your thoughts about automation in this space?
Well, I think that it should free us up from the mundane and leave the interesting problems for humans, right? So the AI eyeballs should be looking at the events, the 9 billion events, or however many are being analyzed by these platforms now. And so the humans get to do the interesting work finally, right? We shouldn't have to do all that high churn, burnout kind of working in a SOC kind of jobs. But the one thing I wanted to mention about AI was this morning I got to go to a session. There's a book called The Ethical Algorithm that was just recently published. And the author, Michael Kearns, is a comp sci professor at the University of Pennsylvania. He also works at Morgan Stanley. And he was talking about two really interesting things. One, privacy. Two, fairness. So how do we make algorithms more ethical? Because everyone kind of knows that there's a sexual bias towards men, because the actuarial table is about credit risk. I think you might have seen this on Twitter, right? There was a feed. Someone was talking about the new Apple Card and how their wife and the husband both applied for it. And, you saw the story. But he was talking about ways of structurally putting in more privacy and more fairness into the algorithms themselves, and not waiting for regulators to come along and say, no, you have to be fair, right? You can't discriminate. And the algorithms do have bias, right? It's inherent in the nature of the data that they were trained on. And so I think that my take on the whole AI thing would be to focus on ethics, and maybe take the whole bug bounty program and turn it into an ethics bounty program. And so you could pay people money to find ethical bias, improve it, and then try to fix the system that way. Maybe re-baseline some of the way that credit reporting and credit risk is done. I know I worked in financial services for a few years, and we worked together at the CME, and that's a huge responsibility, right? But how do you tackle that black box of all those algorithms that are going on that are assigning risk to trades, transactions? I used to run the enterprise server platform for the CME, and there was $1 trillion in contracts traded in the year 2014 when I was there. $1 trillion. Can I give a quick side story about $1 trillion? A lot of people think money is a big thing. Like $1 million though fits in a briefcase. $100 bills, and there's room in there. You have to put bubble wrap in to make sure it doesn't slosh around inside the briefcase. $1 million is not a lot of money. $1 billion is okay, an interesting amount of money. But if you talk about like the hedge funds, like 140 billion AUM, assets under management, that's like one of the top 5 hedge funds. And then you move on from 140 billion, you get up to $1 trillion. That's the market valuation for Apple, right? And then you move up to the CME, it's $250 billion. So think of 1,000 Apple computers, that's the amount of value that's traded in 1 year on the CME. And so how do you protect that infrastructure from bad actors, right? From states, nation states that are trying to, take that money. They're being quite successful at it. I think what was the name of the group, Lazarus, out of North Korea. I was at a security conference and the FBI director of cyber threat intelligence was talking at drinks afterwards, and she was saying there's one named individual in North Korea that was responsible for the Bangladesh bank heist, WannaCry, and Sony. One very productive individual. And it's all our jobs to try to defend against a whole army of these people that are being trained, and going to work every day, as the other presenter was saying. And it's not easy to do, right? But we have to try to shift the paradigms and try to figure out ways to be more proactive rather than reactive. And getting away from passwords, I think, would be a good way to do that. So.
I hope that person does a 4-hour work week as well.
That's
40 weeks. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I think that was the two anecdotes I wanted to offer on that.
The other last thing, and I'll open up the kind of the floor to questions is, and I try to bring in like the kind of the personal story behind the people in security. And I asked that question, like, what would be one of your successes, right? And maybe if you could share like a failure that you've gone through, like your past career.
These are the two open-ended questions at the end of my 20-minute phone screen where I say, tell me a story that you're really proud about, knock it out of the park, and then tell me a failure and how you noticed it. I haven't actually prepared for that one, so I'll have to search my memory real quick. I would say that one of my successes was migrating a Dutch energy company with no downtime to Germany. So we had like 250 apps, and these are apps that control power plants, right? And this is when Stuxnet came out. So I was like scanning our infrastructure for signs of Stuxnet while we're migrating this energy platform to the German company that bought it. And that was an incredible timeline. Basically, they had to get out of the data center by like December 1st. Otherwise, they were going to have to pay like 12 million euros in hosting fees. And so it was like, oh God, we put it off for 5 years because they bought the company 5 years earlier. It was Ascent, Netherlands, was bought by RWE. And they came down to the last minute. It was like a 3-month project. I had to come in and migrate everything, right? I even picked up like a JBOD, right? Just a bunch of disks, and copied a whole bunch of data and drove it in my car to Germany to get that last database over to the other side. And so I think that was really crunch time, right? Because it was a very hard constraint, and that's oftentimes where people do their best work, right? If you're looking at a blank slate and you could do anything and the sky's the limit, and you're doing like a Google Moonshot project or whatever, you're not actually having any constraints, right? You're thinking anything's possible, and that's where you do your least creative work. Wozniak did his best work when he had to write the OS, and write the code for the Apple II, with all these constraints about how much memory you had, what was the speed of the bus, all those kinds of things. So I actually find constraints to be a real blessing. And then the mistake. I would say that one mistake that I made was, typical story. You go into the data center and you're ready to make a change, and cables aren't labeled, and you're like, oh, I'm pretty sure it's this cable, right? And so you pull the cable, and it's like, damn, we really should have labeled those cables. And so it's a typical kind of outage. And so what's the lesson learned? It's really mundane and unsexy to label cables, but if you do, you can avoid a significant loss of a weekend and all of your colleagues having to come in and work that weekend as well to recover from the mistakes.
So and I guess I'll ask you the one last question, like what keeps you up at night, from your job, or like just in general. We talked about a bit about the cyber war that's happening, power outages. There's all kind of things that happen that you talk about in the news.
Well, we actually spoke about this at an event that we were at, because we were having drinks and we were talking about the typical scenario for a disaster in California is what? Earthquake, right? The typical disaster in the Netherlands is a flood because it's under sea level and they have these dikes. And so everyone talks about, well, your servers won't work very well when they're in seawater, right? And so that's the disaster scenario there. But for the energy system, what is the disaster scenario for the grid? It's actually a coronal mass ejection, right? Where the sun flare actually knocks out, like an EMP, half of the electrical infrastructure of planet Earth. And the other half is no longer in the Stone Age, but the half that was facing the sun at the time will be in the Stone Age. So I'm not worried too much about overpopulation, and growth, and I'm worried about sudden depopulation due to a CME. In this case, I don't mean the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. I mean the coronal mass ejection. So we know this kind of thing is going to happen, right? There's been small ones that have taken out satellites and things. But how are we going to recover if we don't have Google, right? Because California was facing the sun when the so anyway, that's the disaster scenario that I worry most about. And it doesn't mean I have to have a bug-out kit, and a rifle and ready to go. It's a hill, but certainly a lot of people are in that mindset right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And don't look up on YouTube and stuff, because you can really go into a rabbit hole there. Spend a lot of time on that. I'm guilty. Why don't we open up just for a couple questions and then we can wrap up. Anybody has questions?
Yeah, why did you switch from philosophy to cybersecurity? Like, what was going through your mind when you did that?
Just repeat the question.
Sure. The question was, when did I switch from philosophy to cybersecurity, and what was going through my mind when I made that decision? Well, like I said, the philosophy career, ended at the Department of Education, and I knew there was nothing I could do to make things better. So again, it was my hobby of hacking and being a computer enthusiast that gave me the career. I've only actually done security with the actual name in my title for the last 3 or 4 years. But I like to say or think that I've been doing security ever since that launch of Starbucks, right? When I tweaked the headers and made Starbucks look like IIS, even though it had an Apache web server in front of it. So I think it's a mindset of tinkering. And a lot of people think of hackers and the hooded, shrouded figure. I don't like that. I think of hackers as good people. I think of a hacker as simply trying the doorknob to see if it's locked. Not because they want to go in and steal, but just because they're curious if the door's locked. Oh, someone really ought to lock that door. Look what I saw on the other side of the door. And so I think of it as like DIY. You just want to hack. You want to put something together in a novel way. One of my favorite phrases was, if you don't know 3 ways of abusing a tool, you don't know how to use it. And so computers are just a tool that I've abused my whole life.
That's another T-shirt that I need to make. One of many.
CISO reporting structures are always a good discussion. Some people report to the CTO, which I do. Some report to the CIO. Others report to the Chief Risk Officer. It really depends. A lot of times there can be a conflict, though, between a security person saying, you got to put more money into this, or this risk has to be mitigated. So really, it's a relationship, regardless of who you report to. You have to be peers. You have to have mutual respect for what it is they're trying to do. Because a lot of times, the person you're arguing with about what's priority and what's not for this quarter, or what risk has to be tackled next, they're arguing on behalf of the business. And you can't really let the business die just because you want to secure the business, right? So you have to find a compromise. And so I think living in Holland for 11 years really taught me a lot about building consensus, because they have a very enlightened socialist approach to doing business. It's not like military command, that you have in business in capitalist America, where they say, just do it. It's like Nike epistemology, just do it, right? Or you're fired. But in Holland, you can't fire people, actually. You have to go to a judge and have them disbanded. And so it's everyone can block, and so you had to get buy-in from all stakeholders everywhere. And so I think that's an important skill, even though it's not valued as much here. But if you build that relationship with people, then it really doesn't matter who you report to, because you have to establish that personal interaction, that social contract with your peers.
I'm sure a couple folks are thinking now where the Dutch embassy is here in New York City.
Well, this is New Amsterdam, right?
Shit, good.
What are the top 3 certs that you recommend for cybersecurity?
Oh, I have a fun answer for this
Yes.
one. The question was, what are the top 3 certifications that I recommend? I recommend none. I have none. And I believe there's 2 kinds of people in security. There's qualified and there's certified. And they're not the same. Certifications are supposed to be a proxy for skills and ability and everything, but I actually have a heretical view on this, right? So there are definitely qualified people with certificates and certifications. But I wrote a book for Cisco in 2002 for a certification that doesn't exist anymore. I went and sat the exam for the certification that I wrote the book for, and I failed. Do you know why? Do you know why? Because it was a marketing thing, right? They just wanted to know, do you know the name of the Cisco product that does X, Y, Z? Not, do you understand security? right? And so I was actually very proud, and that's why I tell the story, that I failed the exam for the cert that I wrote the book for in 2002.
That's a great story. Go ahead.
I was curious how that came about writing the book, and what kept you going so that you finished it.
Oh, that's a fun. Sorry, I always have fun answers. You know, at least in my mind. The thing that happened was there was an acquisition editor came and said, "Hey, you know, you're working at Organic. You're building all these websites. You know about the internet. You know, can you write this book? We have a co-author." That co-author got laid off, so I had to write it myself. And you know what got me through it? Whiskey and one track from Lord of the Rings, which is "May It Be." I played that song on loop until I finished the book. That was my punishment, right? So I would just drink a little whiskey and listen to "May It Be the," you know, or whatever from Lord of the Rings. I can't sing, but and so I actually punished myself to reach page 584 of that book.
If you were to write another one, have you thought about a title? It doesn't have to be about security or internet or anything.
Sure, yeah, no, definitely. I would want to write a book about philosophy, and it would be called Tools for Thought. And it would be the basic things that I've learned on how to take a dichotomy and break it down, how to work on, you know, orthogonal thinking, just how to be a critical thinker. Because these days, you know, that's the only skill that's worth, you know, having. Is because everything else is going to be replaced or displaced by, you know, the mechanization and the robots and the player pianos and, you know, AI. And so the idea here is just be a good critical thinker. Learn how to listen, learn how to think, and learn how to, you know, think outside the box. It's really cliche, but really just how do you approach a problem in a different way? Because that's the one thing I think that, you know, the algorithms won't be very good at. What shape should a fork be, right? Design, right? These are the things that are human, you know, culture setting, you know, and that's always going to be room for artistic input. And you know, maybe you want the fork to have, you know, 3 prongs, so you call it a threek, you know. Anyway, there's all sorts of, you know, hilarious, you know, hopefully funny answers to that question. But yeah, I would like to write a book eventually about philosophy.
You are very fortunate, Mike, in that what you love and what you do to make money touch. Not everyone can have that. Are you happier at work and more motivated now as opposed to at AQR? I'm not a stalker, actually, no one. And what have you learned from music that helps you in your job and vice versa, from studying both for your whole life?
Thanks, that's a good question. The quality of life for me and the quality of work-life balance is about you know, getting job satisfaction out of actually doing the work. Because if your relationship with your employer has devolved to just mutual exploitation, they exploit me for my time and attention, and I exploit them for money, then you've lost, right? So I like to have a social contract, right? The people I work with, because if I call them at 4 a.m., I want them to pick up. And if they call me at 4 a.m., they know I will pick up. And so for me, I have to have job satisfaction in the thing I'm doing. It can't be delayed gratification, it can't be stock options, you know, down the line. You know, I had my organic options, you know, and I was lucky. I was able to make some money during the whole .com rise and fall. But again, it was all luck, not intelligence. But the quality of your work ought to be immediately reserved and valuable to you. And if it's not, then do something else. Because you're not going to die a happy, you know, contented, you know, philosopher king and have lived a good life if you were constantly delaying your gratification or saying, oh, I'm going to put up with this terrible manager. Because most people don't actually leave their job, right? They leave their manager. And so if you don't like your work situation, change it. You know, it's a lot more popular these days, right? 18 months, I think, is the average tenure for a CISO. So I'm in month 10.
Last one.
This is pretty repetitive on quarantine days, but there's progress being made with piracy.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. The question was, has there been progress made against piracy and since the BitTorrent and Napster days? Definitely. I would say that Apple had the best innovation though, which was people are willing to pay for quality, right? Because the quality of those MP3s was shit, you know, back in the Napster days. You know, you'd spend a whole day downloading something off of Usenet or whatever, right? And stitching together the video, and it was like, oh God, it was a cam-held camera in a theater. It's not actually a rip or something, right? And so quality, people will pay for quality. And piracy, the interesting thing, I guess, Disney Plus, right? They have this new offer, direct to consumer, And having worked at Marvel, I had some interest in the future of where that was headed. And people want to pay for quality, and they don't necessarily need to own the media anymore, right? Millennials these days just want a digital locker. They have subscription. They're not too worried about that company going out of business. Disney certainly not. But will they still own that copy of Infinity War 5 years from now? People aren't so much worried about that, and so I think piracy will always exist because people want something for free, and there will always be people that will charge you $5 for something that costs $10 in the store. But in the end, most people actually do want to pay for a reasonable price for an asset, an experience. And in media and entertainment, you look at it like a movie is like maybe $20 to go see a movie these days. 2 hours, that's $10 per hour entertainment. You buy a console game, and it's maybe $50. You get maybe or 70, and you get several. You get plenty of hours of entertainment out of that. But some of the experiences that people are buying and spending time on, are very high value add. Like one of the things I remember learning about the comics business. A comic book is 16 to 22 pages, and it's about 15 minutes of entertainment. But you pay $4 for that. So if you extrapolate that up, that's actually $16 an hour of entertainment. So a comic book is actually a higher value asset than a movie or a console game. It's the source of all of Disney's revenue now, because they have Black Panther and they have Guardians of the Galaxy and all these other incredible characters that are being turned into these huge franchises. Anyway, that's a bit of a digression from piracy. But I do think that the market wants to have a fair value for people's work and to pay the authors and writers, because they're the ones that are stitching together the fabric of society. Like I mentioned about ASCAP and its mission. You want Neil Young to get paid for writing the songs that he wrote that are the soundtrack to your life, and you growing up and learning how to survive.
Perfect. We're out of time, but you will be around.
Do you have a hobby as a comedian?
I am not a comedian, no. But I do preserve and promote different little anecdotes, and so hopefully you enjoyed some of them tonight.
Who was your favorite philosopher?
My favorite philosopher.
Are you a Stoic?
I have been, yeah. There was actually, this is a funny one, right? You can't step into the same river twice. Heraclitus, right? He was the Greek philosopher that said, and this is like digital transformation, right? This is an analogy that you can use. The goalpost is constantly moving. They keep moving the cheese, right? And this idea that you can't step into the same river twice means you're on a journey, right? And if you're on a digital journey with your company, you might decide to raft the rapids and go real fast and try to transform quickly. Or you might want to sit in a bloat and float in an inner tube drinking a beer going around a big oxbow and take it easy. But the fun thing that I liked about the philosophers was that there was somebody that thought you can't even step into the river once, and his name was Cratylus. And so he used to wander around Athens just waving his finger, proving the point that you cannot communicate. And so if you want to insult a philosopher, you just call him a finger-waving Cratylus.
This was a fantastic one. Thank you very much. Okay, so